for them tonight. That's a ground ball to the right side, speared by Phillips, flips to Eckersley. Yes, he's there in time, and the A's are the world champions.
Remember the 70s and 80s when the Oakland Athletics won the World Series 4 times? Seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? When they had the likes of their star Hall of Fame closer, Rollie Fingers, who stood out for his mustache as much as his many saves and coming through in the clutch, helping him win multiple World Series and American League pennants. There was Reggie Jackson, the great slugger. Long before he was the straw that stirred the drink in the Bronx for the Yankees, he was the big man who helped the A's win those early World Series in 1972, 1973, and 1974. And then we come to the closer of the late 1980s, the great Dennis Eckersley, who, like Rollie Fingers, also had a famous mustache, and was a legendary Hall of Fame closer who led them to that World Series in 1989, as well as 2 more pennants in 1988 and 1990. And how could we forget Mark McGwire, who, along with Jose Canseco, formed the Bash Brothers, and he was hitting home runs at a furious pace in his first few years in Oakland. Oakland made the playoffs 9 times from 1972 to 1992. In that time period, Oakland won 6 American League pennants and 4 World Series titles. Nobody seems to remember the Oakland A's golden period anymore when they were a premier team, as they would go on to average 82 losses for the next 7 seasons. That's when the A's turned to new general manager and former player Billy Beane to restore a winning tradition in the club that had not been seen since the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. They were led by the likes of their slugger Jason Giambi, who at first base was one of the premier players in the game, outfielder Johnny Damon, who would go on to become a great player with the Red Sox and the Yankees, and promising young pitcher Jason Isringhausen, who was part of an elite pitching staff in Oakland. In 2000, the A's went from worst to first, clinching their first American League Western Division title in 8 years, but the playoff run wouldn't last long as they would lose to the Yankees, who were on their way to their 3rd straight World Series title. However, Oakland, who won 102 games the next year, would get the Yankees again in the first round of the playoffs, and took a 2-0 lead heading back to Oakland, needing to win just 1 more game to get to the American League Championship Series. But from then on, it was all Yankees. In Game 3, with Oakland trying to tie the game, Jeremy Giambi forgot how to slide, and Derek Jeter turned in one of the most famous plays the game has ever seen, the flip play to nail Giambi at the plate, as the Yankees would win the 2 games in Oakland. Back in the Bronx for Game 5, David Justice's home run all but sealed Oakland's fate, and the Oakland A's became the first team to blow a 2-0 lead in a best-of-5 series after winning the first 2 games on the road. Little did we know that 2 years later, Oakland would blow a lead against New York's biggest rivals in reverse and far more painful fashion. In the off-season, due to high cost, the A's were forced to unload their best players. Damon was sent to the Boston Red Sox, Jason Giambi was sent to the New York Yankees, and their promising young pitcher Jason Isringhausen went to the St. Louis Cardinals. Billy Beane needed to find a way to keep the Oakland A's elite. He hired Paul DePodesta from the Cleveland Indians to be his assistant general manager. DePodesta introduced him to a theory that was similar to that of the great Bill James. The theory would be called Moneyball. The theory was not to buy wins, but to buy runs and get on base. Now, stats such as on-base percentage would be taken more seriously in terms of buying or signing a free agent. At the time, the Oakland A's were worth $39 million, and that was the total of their payroll. The New York Yankees' payroll, on the other hand, was worth a whopping $215 million, as they were the most valuable team in North American sports by far. And trust me, it wasn't even close. But Billy Beane believed that this theory could work, much to the disagreement of most of his employees. The players that were brought in to replace the stars weren't household names. One of the players was David Justice, who hit the home run in the playoffs the previous year for the Yankees. Sideball pitcher Chad Bradford, who teams stayed away from because of his pitching motion. And first baseman Scott Hatterberg, who was a catcher all of his career, but only became a first baseman when he went to Oakland to replace Giambi. The theory didn't work at first, as the A's lost 26 of their first 46 games and were well behind the Angels for first place in the American League West. Manager Art Howe, who was one of Billy's chief critics, resisted starting Scott Hatterberg at first base, and he decided to keep starting upstart first baseman Carlos Pena, who was clearly a better hitter, much to Billy Beane's chagrin. However, at the trade deadline in July of 2002, Beane traded Pena to the Detroit Tigers, and the A's took off from there.
Can't get it. Hits fastest to the wall by the scoreboard. 1 run is in. 2 runs are in. Alive. Was it Harry?
Something strange is now happening at Oakland. You cannot argue the point right now.
12 in a row. They're making a joke out of the American League. They were in Detroit today, and
he throws to first, and that's the sound of 14 straight victories.
14 straight, the longest run in the bigs this year. It has slingshot the A's into first in the AL West. It's a nice.
This team was written off. How do you explain otherwise? How do you explain otherwise some of the victories that they've come up with?
The Oakland A's are going to win 16 consecutive games. First win streak in baseball, folks, in 25 years. The A's have won 16 in a row.
Good pitch, here it is. Swing and a miss. Struck him out. Number 17. It's tickets.
The Oakland A's are 2 wins away from tying the American League record. The most amazing thing you could ever imagine has happened over the last 4 days at the Coliseum.
Up the middle, the A's have won 19 in a row.
19 in a row.
With destiny, they're going for the all-time American League record. 20 games in a row. We're going to 20. We're going to take the AL record at 20, baby.
In the biggest game of the season, and what will go down as one of the most memorable games in Major League Baseball history, Oakland would blow an 11-0 lead when Scott Hatterberg stepped up to the plate in the bottom of the 9th and delivered this. A walk-off home run off Kansas City Royals pitcher Jason Grimsley, giving the A's a 12-11 victory and giving them an American League record 20th consecutive victory, breaking the joint record set by the 1906 Chicago White Sox and the legendary 1947 New York Yankees. No one, not even the 1927 Yankees or the 2001 Mariners, won as many games in a row as Oakland, and those two teams have ridiculously high payrolls, and 2 of the best offenses in the game at the time. Oakland, who signed a bunch of nobodies with all due respect to replace the superstars, made history, and that year they won 103 games, the best record in the league. In the first round of that year's playoffs, the A's were heavily favored to defeat the American League Central champion Minnesota Twins, who were led by the likes of Torrey Hunter, David Ortiz, and a promising young pitcher in Johan Santana. But Oakland would blow a 2-1 series lead, and the series would go back to Oakland for a decisive 5th game, where in the top of the 9th inning of that Game 5, Minnesota had a big offensive explosion, scoring 3 runs, including a 2-run homer by A.J. Brzezinski and a big RBI insurance hit by David Ortiz, who began his postseason legacy not in Boston as many people think. However, Oakland would rally to make it a 5-4 game in the 9th inning, but it wasn't enough as Minnesota were able to close out Oakland on their home field, and for the 3rd straight year, the A's went one and done, losing in 5 games as the favorite. In the coming years, Oakland would suffer more playoff devastation. The next year, they won the American League West, and in the first round of the playoffs, they took a 2-0 lead over the Boston Red Sox, including a dramatic come-from-behind Game 1 victory. They just needed to win one more game to advance to the American League Championship Series. But Oakland's chances of getting to that series were delayed for at least another day, as the Red Sox won Game 3 following Oakland's comedy of errors and Trot Nixon's first of the series being that 2-run homer. They had a 4-3 lead heading into the 8th inning of Game 4, where the Red Sox would come back again as David Ortiz's big 2-run double helped the Sox get past Oakland and send the series back for a Game 5. Keith Falk would go on to coincidentally pitch for the Red Sox, who would snap their 86-year curse the very next year. And that was the first time Ortiz established himself as a true hero in Boston. Game 5 was a thriller, but Oakland were unable to come back as Derek Lowe's famous strikeout of Terrence Long helped the Red Sox win the series. After 2 years away from the playoffs, Oakland would go on and win the American League West again in 2006. This year seemed like the year it would happen, and the Oakland A's faced the Minnesota Twins again. This Twins team was also led by Torrey Hunter and a promising young catcher named Joe Mauer. Of course, Mark Kotze's famous inside-the-park home run helped Oakland win the first 2 games in Minnesota. And the champagne was all set back at McAfee Coliseum in Oakland, as for the first time since 1990, the Oakland A's would win a playoff series as they finished off a sweep of Minnesota on their home field. And it finally seemed like this would be the year the A's would win the pennant and get back to to the World Series. With the team they had the likes of Frank Thomas, Bobby Crosby, Bobby Kilty, just to name a few. But the party and the celebration would not last long, as the A's quickly were swept out of the American League Championship Series by the Detroit Tigers, as Maglio Ordonez's famous 3-run homer helped contribute in the moment that the Tigers would go on to the World Series that year, as Oakland would suffer another playoff heartbreak. Oakland would go on to miss the playoffs for the next 5 years. In 2012, Oakland won the West, but were eliminated by the Tigers again. However, the two would meet again 12 months later. In one of the most famous series, Oakland blew another 2-1 lead. And this time, they were no match for Justin Verlander's arm, as the bats could not get anything going late on in the game. And the Oakland A's would lose yet another 5th game, yet another elimination game on their home field. And once again, it was the Tigers who took him down, the thorn in their side that it seemed they could not beat. And yes, Torrey Hunter was in that team as well. That Tigers team would lose to the Red Sox in the American League Championship Series a few weeks later. The very next year, Oakland found themselves playing in the American League wildcard game against an upstart Kansas City Royals team that were playing in the playoffs for the first time in nearly 3 decades. The game started off well for Oakland, as John Lester pitched well, only giving up 3 runs through the first few innings, and Oakland raced out to a 7-3 lead late in the game, led by the legs of the big hitting that was Coco Crisp's big RBIs. And it seemed as if Oakland would advance to the division series. But this Kansas City team was not one to die, as they slowly came back into the game, and Oakland continued to fall apart with pitching mistakes all around. Then, in the 8th inning, Kansas City would get the game down to just 1 run, and it seemed as if it was destined that Kansas City would come back. In the bottom of the 9th, with just 1 out, a sacrifice fly confirmed just that, as Kansas City came from 4 runs down and were able to tie the game, sending it to extra innings. However, Oakland would retake the lead in the top of the 12th inning as they drove in a huge RBI, a big insurance run, and now the A's were just 3 outs away from moving on to the divisional series. But Kansas City, as I mentioned, were not a team that would shy away and would go away. And Kansas City came back as Oakland committed a comedy of errors in the bottom of the 12th inning, including 2 outfielders colliding into one another, just what you need in an elimination playoff game. And just like that, a big bloop infield single helped Kansas City tie the game. And just a few batters later, Kansas City ended Billy Beane's dream season once again, and the A's would lose 9-8. The team has not recovered, as they have finished in last place in the West for the past 3 seasons. The big question is, did Moneyball work? The answer is quite simply both. Why did it work, you may ask? Because Oakland was one of the premier teams in the American League for a 12-year time span, as they made the playoffs every year from 2000 to 2003 and 2012 to 2014. Just one problem: they were a contender, but they weren't champions, as Oakland won just 1 playoff series.